Okay, so welcome to my channel. So today we are going to go through. So we are starting the nervous system. So since previously we did the nervous tissue, so it's important to just revise the nervous tissue before now starting the nervous system. But let's do an introduction on the nervous system. So this is an introduction on the nervous system. So this is the most complex system in the human body, and it is composed of cells that are specialized for reception, integration, interpretation, and transmission of information. Okay, then the nervous system is divided into two. We have one where we have the central nervous system, which is consisting of the brain and the spinal cord. This is the central nervous system. Then you also have the nuclei, where the nerve cell bodies, which are the nerve cell bodies in the central nervous system. Then you have the peripheral nervous system. So the peripheral nervous system is composed of the cranial, spinal, and peripheral nerves conducting impulses to and from the central nervous system. Then you have the ganglia, which is the nerve cell bodies outside the central nervous system. So meaning the nerve cell bodies now in the peripheral and the other and outside. Okay, so that's the division. Okay. So these are the two divisions we are talking about. So you have the central nervous system, and you have this is the central nervous system. You have the peripheral for the cranial nerves, spinal nerves, and the ganglia. Okay. So this is what we are just been talking about, classification of the nervous system. Okay, so peripheral nervous system, central, we talk about the brain and the spinal cord. Then we just discuss the structures that are found in the brain and structures that also found in the spinal cord. And the brain is again it has a lot of structures. So again, you start talking about them in details now. Okay, then if you go to the peripheral nervous system, you have the other divisions of the peripheral nervous system, such as the autonomic nervous system, the somatic nervous system, and the autonomic nervous system is further divided into the sympathetic and the parasympathetic nervous system. Okay, so now in this lecture we are just going to concentrate on the central nervous system alone. Okay, so we are just going to concentrate on the central nervous system alone. We are not going to combine the with the central and the peripheral. Okay, so let's start. So we discussed to say the spinal cord is one of the structures found in the central nervous system, and the spinal cord is just a white matter which is found in the peripheral, and the gray matter is found in the internal and as a general shape of the letter H. Okay, that's for the spinal cord. Then the central canal of the spinal cord contains CSF. That is the central canal. It contains CSF. Okay, then it is lined by ependymal cells. So the central canal of the spinal cord, we are saying it contains CSF, which is the cerebrospinal fluid, and that cerebrospinal fluid also is in the same central canal. It is lined by ependymal cells, which also again secrete the same cerebrospinal fluid. That's what we are saying here. Okay. So then you have the anterior horn, which contains motor neurons. Then you have the posterior horn, which contains sensory neurons. Okay, then that's the spinal cord. We are done with the spinal cord. Then for the brain, so we started with the spinal cord, then we go to the brain, and the brain is actually the most complex one again. Okay, so the brain, as the adult brain, consists of four major parts. So we have the brainstem, we have the cerebelli, we have the brainstem, we have the cerebrum, we have the diencephalon, and the cerebrum. So these are the four major parts of the brain we are talking about. Okay, so these are the four major parts of the brain. So in a recap, before we go any further, we are saying number one major part is the brainstem, number two is the cerebrum, the diencephalon, and the cerebrum. Okay, then let's start with the brainstem. So the brainstem is continuous with the spinal cord and it consists of the medulla oblongata, the pons, and the midbrain. Then uh, we have the cerebrum, which is posterior to the brainstem. That's known as the cerebrum. So this is another structure, the cerebrum. Then the other structure is the diencephalon, which is superior to the brainstem. And this one consists of the thalamus, hypothalamus, and the epithalamus. And it is usually supported on the diencephalon and the brainstem. And the structure that is supported on the diencephalon and the brainstem is the cerebrum, which is the largest part of the brain. Okay, so we have the cerebellum and the cerebrum. So, but the cerebrum is the largest part of the brain and it is supported on the encephalon and the diencephalon and the brainstem. Okay, so this is the structure of the brain and these big structures. So we have the cerebellum. Okay, we have the diencephalon, of the brainstem, and we have the cerebrum. Okay, so let's move on from then. Okay, so let's talk about the protective coverings of the brain. So the protective covering of the brains, we have the cranium and the craniomeninges, and these ones surround and protect the brain. Then you have the craniomeninges now in detail. So the craniomeninges are continuous with the spinal meninges. They have the same basic structure, also bear the same names. So it's as the same names. We have the outer dura mater, we have the middle arachnoid mater, and we have the inner pia mater. Okay. Then, however, the cranial dura mater has two layers, whilst the spinal dura mater has only one layer. So in as much as they have the same names, in terms of layers, the cranial dura mater has two layers, whilst the spinal dura mater has only one layer. Okay. Then you have the two dura layers which are found around the brain, which are fused together, then except where they separate to enclose the dura venous sinuses that drain venous blood from the brain and deliver it into the internal jugular veins. So that's about the protective covering. Okay, this is what we're talking about. Okay, so we have the craniomeninges or the dura mater and the arachnoid mater and the pia mater E. So these are the craniomeninges, and you say the names correspond with the spinal meninges. Okay, but there's a difference in the layers of the dura mater, the spinal dura mater and the cranial dura mater. Okay, then we have also blood vessels that enters the brain tissue and pass along the surface of the brain. This one they penetrate inward and they are sheathed by a loose fitting sleeve of pia matter. Okay, and there are three extensions of the dura mater that separate parts of the brain. Number one, we have the falx cerebri, which separates the two hemispheres, which are the sides of the cerebrum. Then you have the falx cerebelli, which separates the two hemispheres of the cerebellum. Then you have the tentorium cerebelli, which separates the cerebrum from the cerebellum. Okay. Okay, so this is a tentorium cerebral. So these are the three extensions of the dura mater. That's the separates parts of the. Okay, so this is what we have from talking about the fox cerebri. We have the tentorium cerebri. Okay, so and this is where they are the separate parts of the brain. Okay, so let's make progress. So now let's talk about the ventricles of the brain. So the ventricles of the brain are found, of course, within the brain, and there are four irregularly shaped cavities or ventricles. And these same ventricles are the ones which contain the cerebrospinal fluid, the CSF. So if it's your first time hearing about the ventricles of the brain, remember the heart has ventricles as well. It has two, whilst the brain has four ventricles. Okay, and the brain's ventricles contain CSF. Okay, so let's move. So the ventricles, they are four, and they are named. Number one, we have the right lateral ventricles, and you have the left lateral ventricle. And the third one is known as the third ventricle, and the fourth one is known as the fourth ventricle. As easy as they sound. Okay, so these are the ventricles. So you have the lateral ventricle, so you have the right and the left lateral ventricle. Then you have the third ventricle, then finally you have the fourth ventricle. Yeah. So let's talk about the lateral ventricle. So the lateral ventricle, these cavities lie within the cerebral hemispheres. So one on each side of the median plane, just below the corpus callosum. Then they are separated from each other by a thin membrane, which is the septum lucidum, and lined with ciliated epithelium. They communicate with the third ventricle by interventricular foramina. Then that's the lateral ventricles. Then let's go to the third ventricle. So the third ventricle is a cavity situated below the lateral ventricles between the two parts of the thalamus, and it communicates with the fourth ventricle by a canal. Apart from the canal, it's also separated by the cerebral aqueduct or aqueduct of the midbrain. So that's the third ventricle. Then for the fourth ventricle, this one is a diamond-shaped cavity. Okay. Then it is situated below and behind the third ventricle and between the cerebellum and pons. Then it is continuous and below with the central canal of the spinal cord. Then it also communicates with the subarachnoid space by the foramina in its roof. Then the same fourth ventricle, the cerebrospinal fluid, enters the subarachnoid space from the fourth ventricle. Then it enters through the subarachnoid space through these openings and through the open distal end of the central canal of the spinal cord. Okay, so we are done with the ventricles. So let's now talk about the brain blood flow. So blood flows to the brain mainly via the internal carotid and vertebral arteries. So we have the internal jugular veins which return blood from the head to the heart. And then in an adult, the brain represents only 2% of the total body weight, but consumes about 20% of the oxygen and glucose used even at rest. Then you have neurons that synthesize ATP almost exclusively from glucose via reactions that use oxygen. Then when activity of neurons and neuroglia increases in a region of the brain, the blood flow to that area also increases. Then even a brief slowing of the brain blood flow may cause unconsciousness. Then because virtually no glucose is stored in the brain, the supply of glucose also must be continuous. Then if blood entering the brain has a low level of glucose, mental confusion, dizziness, convulsions, and loss of consciousness may actually occur. Okay, so that's it about the blood flow. Then there's also what we call the blood-brain barrier, the BBB. So this BBB protects the brain cells from harmful substances and pathogens by preventing passage of many substances from the blood into the blood tissue. Then it consists mainly of tight junctions that seal together the endothelial cells of the brain capillaries, along with a thick basement membrane around the capillaries. Then a few water-soluble substances such as glucose cross the blood-brain barrier by active transport, whilst other substances, so which ones exactly? So other substances such as creatinine, urea, and most ions cross the BBB very slowly. Then still other substances such as proteins and most antibiotic drugs do not pass at all from the blood into the brain tissue. So meaning these ones need to find other ways of passing, or you have to find other drugs that are able to do that. So however, lipid soluble substances such as oxygen and carbon dioxide, alcohol, and most anesthetic agents easily cross the blood-brain barrier. Then trauma and certain toxins and inflammation can cause a breakdown of the blood-brain barrier. So in terms of inflammation actually causes the integrity of the blood-brain barrier to be lost, and hence of course someone may actually allow even harmful substances to cross the BBB. So now let's talk about the cerebrospinal fluid, the CSF. The CSF is a clear colorless liquid that protects the brain and the spinal cord from chemical and physical injuries. So it also carries oxygen, glucose, and other needed chemicals from the blood to neurons and neuroglia. Then the CSF continuously secretes through the cavities in the brain and the spinal cord, and around the brain and spinal cord in the subarachnoid space. Then the total volume of CSF is 80 to 150 ml in an adult. Then the CSF contains glucose, proteins, lactic acid, urea, cations such as sodium, potassium, calcium, magnesium, and other anions such as chloride and bicarbonate. Then it also contains some white blood cells as well. Those are the components of the cerebrospinal fluid. So the CSF contributes to homeostasis in three main ways. Okay, so number one, we have the mechanical protection. So CSF serves as a shock absorbing medium that protects the delicate tissues of the cerebrospinal, of the brain and the spinal cord. That's mechanical protection. Then the other protection is chemical protection. So CSF provides an optimal chemical environment for accurate neuronal signaling. So even slight changes in the ionic composition of CSF within the brain can seriously disrupt the production of action potentials and postsynaptic potentials. Then lastly, you have circulation. CSF allows exchange of nutrients and waste products between the blood and the nervous tissue. Okay, so how is CSF formed? So formation of CSF in the ventricles. So if you have been wondering exactly how is CSF formed, so the sites of CSF production are the choroid plexuses, which are found in the walls of the ventricles, and these are covered by ependymal cells that form cerebrospinal fluid from blood plasma by filtration and secretion. Then the ependymal cells are joined by tight junctions, and we also have materials that enters the CSF actually passes through the ependymal cells. Then the blood cerebrospinal fluid barrier permits certain substances to enter the CSF but excludes others, protecting the brain and spinal cord from potentially harmful blood-borne substances. Okay, so this is a structure showing you the ependymal cell, and you have the blood capillary here. Then you have the tight junctions of the ependymal cells, and the one which will be formed after secretion is of course CSF. Okay, so this is one ventricle we are showing you. Okay, so let's talk about secretion of CSF. How does it secrete after it has been formed? So the CSF is formed in the choroid plexuses of each lateral ventricles and flows into the third ventricle. Then through it flows to the third ventricle through two narrow oval openings, which we call the interventricular foramina. Then when more CSF is added by the choroid plexus in the roof of the third ventricle, then the fluid then flows through the aqueduct of the midbrain or the cerebral aqueduct, which passes into the fourth ventricle. Then the choroid plexus of the fourth ventricle contributes more fluid. Then CSF enters the subarachnoid space through three openings in the roof of the fourth ventricle. Then you have the median aperture and the paired lateral apertures, one on each side. So one thing I've noticed about this, a long time ago, this aperture, the median apertures and the paired lateral apertures, even the aqueduct of the midbrain or the cerebral aqueduct had other names. So if you have ever studied the how CSF flows or the flow of CSF, find that here you find that there are names which are missing, like the Magenzi, the aqueduct of Sylvius and whatnot. Those ones are missing because we are using anatomical names rather than the names of people who discovered them. Okay, so after, of course, it has flown to the median apertures and the paired lateral apertures, it again passes through the CSF then again secretes in the central canal of the spinal cord and in the subarachnoid space around the surface of the brain and the spinal cord. Okay, so this is another structure showing you from the lateral ventricles, it has to go into the third ventricle, then finally it goes into the fourth ventricle. That's how it works. Okay, so from the lateral ventricles, third ventricle, then fourth ventricle. Okay, that's the flow of CSF. So from the lateral ventricles, then from the lateral ventricles go to the third ventricle, the fourth ventricle, then from the lateral ventricles goes through the interventricular foramina to the third ventricle, cerebral aqueduct, then fourth ventricle. Okay, so CSF is gradually reabsorbed into the blood. Of course, after it has now passed through the subarachnoid villi, then the central canal, the spinal cord, then again there is CSF that is gradually reabsorbed into the blood. So this one is absorbed into the blood through the arachnoid villi, which are finger-like extensions of the arachnoid. Then normally CSF is reabsorbed as rapidly as it is formed by the choroid plexuses. Then because the rates of formation and reabsorption are the same, the pressure of the CSF normally is constant. Okay, so this is the summary of the formation, secretion, and absorption of the cerebrospinal fluid. So CSF is formed in the ventricles of the brain by the choroid plexuses. So it is formed, for instance, it has to pass through the lateral ventricles. From the lateral ventricles it will flow through the interventricular foramina into the third ventricle. From the third ventricle, it will flow through the aqueduct of the midbrain or the cerebral aqueduct into the fourth ventricle. From the fourth ventricle, going to flow through the lateral and the median apertures into the subarachnoid space. From the subarachnoid space, it's going to be absorbed by the arachnoid villi of the dura mater of the venous sinuses into the venous blood, and to go to the heart and lungs, the arterial blood. Then it is going to be reabsorbed back, and it's going to go back to the choroid plexuses that are found in the fourth ventricle, third ventricle, and the lateral ventricles. Okay, and we are saying since the rate of reabsorption and the rate of production is at the same rate, so meaning the pressure of the CSF is constant. Okay, so we are done with the CSF. Then let's look at the brainstem. So the brainstem, the part of the brain. This is the part of the brain between the spinal cord and the diencephalon. So it consists of three structures, or the medulla oblongata, the pons, and the midbrain. Okay, that's the brainstem. Okay, so we are talking about the brainstem. Then one structure which we mentioned about the brainstem that it has is the medulla oblongata. So let's look at the medulla oblongata. So this one, the medulla oblongata, is continuous with the superior part of the spinal cord. Then it forms the inferior part of the brainstem. Then we have the medulla which extends to the inferior border of the pons. Then you have the medulla's white matter, which contains all sensory tracts and motor tracts that extends between the spinal cord and the other parts of the brain. Then some of the white matter forms bulges on the anterior aspects of the medulla. Then these protrusions, called the pyramids, formed by the large corticospinal tracts that pass from the cerebrum to the spinal cords. Okay, so that's the medulla oblongata. This is the transverse section and anterior surface of the medulla oblongata. Okay, so the corticospinal tracts control the voluntary movements of the limbs and trunk. Then just superior to the junction of the medulla with the spinal cord, 90% of the axons in the left pyramid cross the right side, and 90% of the axons in the right pyramid cross the left side. So meaning we are saying those trunks actually they take from the axons in the left. The axons in the left go to the right side, then the axons in the right goes into the left side. Then this crossing is called the decussation of pyramids. Then each side of the brain controls voluntary movement on the opposite side of the body. So since due to the decussations of the pyramids, so the left side of the brain actually controls the right side of the brain. Then the right side of the brain controls the left side of the brain. So if for instance you have a needle prick on the right side, and due to the reflex, you actually pull away from the stimuli. The one which has caused that kind of movement on the right hand is the left side of the brain. So since we are saying the left side, controls what's on the right, then the right side controls what's on the left. That's what we're talking about. Okay, and then the medulla also contains several nuclei. Then some of these nuclei control vital body functions, and the examples of nuclei in the medulla that regulate vital activities include the cardiovascular center and the medullary rhythmicity area. Okay. Okay, so that's the two areas it controls, it regulates. So let's start with one area it regulates, which is the cardiovascular center. So the cardiovascular center regulates the rate and force of the heartbeat and the diameter of the blood vessels. Then the medullary rhythmicity area of the respiratory center adjusts the basic rhythm of breathing. So this is more like the rhythm center or the rhythm area of the respiratory center. Okay, that's the medullary rhythmicity area. Okay, then the nuclei in the medulla also reflexes for as reflex also controls reflexes for vomiting, swallowing, sneezing, coughing, and hiccuping. Okay, so the vomiting center of the medulla causes vomiting, which is the forcible expulsion of the contents of the upper gastrointestinal tract through the mouth. Then the deglutination center of the medulla promotes swallowing or deglutination of a mass of food that has moved from the oral cavity of the mouth into the pharynx. Okay. Then sneezing involves spasmodic contraction of breathing muscles that forcefully expel air through the nose and mouth. Then coughing involves a long drawn deep inhalation and then a strong exhalation that suddenly sends a blast of air through the upper respiratory passage. Then hiccuping is caused by spasmodic contractions of the diaphragm that ultimately result in the production of a sharp sound on inhalation. Those are some of the reflexes that the medulla controls. Okay, then just lateral to each pyramid is an oval-shaped swelling called the oveline, the olive. Then within the olive is the inferior olivary nucleus, which receives input from the cerebral cortex, the midbrain, and the spinal cord. Then you have the neurons of the inferior olivary nucleus that extends their axons into the cerebellum, where they regulate the activity of cerebellar neurons. Then by influencing cerebellar neuron activity, the inferior olivary nucleus provides instructions that the cerebellum uses to make adjustments to muscle activity as you learn new motor skills. Okay, then the nuclei is actually associated with the sensations of touch, pressure, vibration, and conscious proprioception, which are located in the posterior part of the medulla. So these nuclei are the right and the left gracile nucleus and the cuneate nucleus. Then the ascending sensory axons of the gracile fasciculus and the cuneate fasciculus, which are two tracts in the posterior columns of the spinal cord, form synapses in these nuclei. Then you have the postsynaptic neurons, then relay the sensory information to the thalamus on the opposite side of the midbrain. Then the axons are sent to the thalamus in a band of white matter called the medial lemniscus, which extends through the medulla, pons, and the midbrain. Then the tracts of the posterior columns and the axons of the medial lemniscus are collectively known as the posterior column medial lemniscus pathway. Okay, so this is what we are talking about specifically. Okay, okay, I think we can move. So this is also one picture showing the fasciculus, the grassa fasciculus, the cuneate fasciculus. So these are some of the things you need to know in terms of where they are located exactly in the brain. Okay, so the medulla also contains nuclei that are components of the sensory pathway for gustation, which is taste, audition, which is hearing, and equilibrium, which is balance. So the gustatory nucleus of the medulla is part of the gustatory pathway from the tongue to the brain. Then it receives gustatory input from the taste buds of the tongue. Then the cochlear nuclei of the medulla are part of the auditory pathway from the inner ear to the brain. Then they receive auditory input from the cochlea of the inner ear. Then you have the vestibular nuclei of the medulla and pons, which are components of the equilibrium pathway from the inner ear to the brain. They receive sensory information associated with the equilibrium from the proprioceptions or proprioceptors in the vestibular apparatus of the inner ear. Okay, so this is an example of the gustatory area of the cerebral cortex. And of course, you know that the tongue is one which actually is involved in the gustatory pathway, and it sends its information to the facial nerve, the glossopharyngeal nerve, the vagus nerve, then finally to the gustatory nucleus, then sends to the thalamus and the primary gustatory area of the cerebral cortex. Okay, so that's the pathway. So these are also just showing you the some of the reflexes that are involved in the. For instance, this is a vestibular area in the cerebral cortex. Then it's showing you how the information actually travels in the ear. So this is from the ear for equilibrium. Now, so this is now showing you how the information travels from the ear for equilibrium, then all the way to the vestibular area in the cerebral cortex. Then the medulla contains nuclei associated with 5 pairs of cranial nerves as well, which are the vestibulocochlear nerve, which is the cranial nerve number 8, the glossopharyngeal nerve, it's cranial nerve number 9, then you have the vagus nerve, it's cranial nerve number 10, then you have the accessory nerve, which is cranial nerve number 11 on the cranial portion. Then you also have the hypoglossal, which is cranial nerve number 12. So these are some of the cranial nerves that are associated with the medulla nuclei. Okay, so the cranial nerves here and the associated structure here. Okay, but just know that the medulla nuclei, those are some of the associated cranial nerves, the hypoglossal, the vagus. Okay, then so we're done with the medulla. Let's look at the pons. So the pons, which means bridge, lies directly superior to the medulla and anterior to the cerebellum. So these connects different parts of the brain with one another. Then these connections are provided by bundles of axons. Then the pons consists of nuclei, sensory tracts, and motor tracts. Then there are nuclei within the pons which act as relay stations, and some of these are associated with the cranial. These are some of the things you have to learn. Okay, so these are the how the pons are connected. Okay, then the pons also contains vestibular nuclei that are components of the equilibrium, like the last picture was showing. So the vestibular nuclei that are the components of the equilibrium pathway from the inner ear to the brain. Then other nuclei in the pons are the pneumotaxic area and the apneistic area of the respiratory center. Then together with the medulla rhythmicity area, the pneumotaxic area and the apneustic areas help control breathing. Then the pons also contain nuclei associated with the following four pairs of the cranial nerves. So the trigeminal nerves, we have the abducens nerves, we have the facial nerves, and we have the vestibulocochlear nerves. These are some of the four pairs of the cranial nerves that the pons nuclei are associated with. Okay, so let's go to the midbrain. Okay, midbrain. So the midbrain is the area of the brain situated around the cerebral aqueduct between the cerebrum above and below, between the cerebrum above and the pons below. It consists of groups of cell bodies and nerve fibers or tracts which connect the cerebrum with the lower parts of the brain and with the spinal cord. Then the cell bodies act as relay stations for the ascending and descending nerve. Okay, so that's the midbrain. So now let's look at the reticular formation. So in addition to the well-defined nuclei, the brainstem consists of small clusters of neuronal cell bodies, which are the gray matter, interspersed among small bundles of myelinated axons. Then the broad region where the white matter and the gray matter exhibit a net-like arrangement is known as the reticular formation. So reticular formation, this is a broad region where white matter and gray matter exhibit a net-like arrangement. Then the neurons within the reticular formation have both ascending to the sensory part and the descending to the motor for motor functions. Then the part of the reticular formation called the reticular activating system consists of sensory axons that project to the cerebral cortex. Okay, so those are some of the things. Okay, so what are the functions of the reticular formation? So the reticular formation is involved in coordination of the skeletal muscle activity associated with voluntary motor movement and maintenance of balance. Then there is coordination of activity controlled by the autonomic nervous system. For instance, you also have the cardiovascular, respiratory, and gastrointestinal activities. Then you also have selective awareness that functions through the reticular activating system or the RAS system, which selectively blocks or passes sensory information to the cerebral cortex, e.g., the slight sound made by a sick child moving in bed may arouse his mother, but the noise of irregularly passing trains may be suppressed. So these are some of the selective awareness. that actually functions through the reticular activating systems. Then we have the cerebellum. Okay, so the cerebellum is situated behind the pons and immediately below the posterior portion of the cerebrum, occupying the posterior cranial fossa. It is ovoid in shape and has two hemispheres, separated by a narrow median strip called the vermis. Then you have gray matter, which forms the surface of the cerebellum, and white matter lies deep. So this is the cerebellum, and you have a separation which is known as the vermis. Okay, so again, this is cerebellum, and you have the vermis of the white matter and the gray matter which is deeply. Okay. So the functions of the cerebellum is concerned. So the cerebellum is concerned with the coordination of voluntary muscular movement, posture, and balance. So we have the cerebral activities are not under voluntary control. Then the cerebellum controls and coordinates the movements of various groups of muscles, ensuring smooth, even, precise actions. Then it coordinates activities associated with the maintenance of the balance and equilibrium of the body. Then the sensory input for these functions is derived from the muscles and joints, the eyes and the ears. Okay, then we have proprioceptor impulses from the muscles and joints that indicate their position and in relation to the body as a whole, and those impulses from the eyes and the semicircular canals in the ears provide information about the position of the head in space. Then you have impulses from the cerebellum, which influence the contraction of the skeletal muscle so that balance and posture is maintained. Then you have damage to the cerebellum results in clumsy, uncoordinated muscular movement, staggering gait, and the inability to carry out smooth, steady, precise movements. Okay, so we are now done with the cerebellum. Let's look at the diencephalon. So the diencephalon extends from the brainstem to the cerebrum and surrounds the third ventricle. So it includes the thalamus, the hypothalamus, and the epithalamus. So let's look at the thalamus. So the thalamus consists of two masses of nerve cells and fibers situated within the cerebral hemispheres, just below the corpus callosum, one on each side of the third ventricle. Then it consists of paired oval masses of gray matter organized into nuclei with interspersed tracts of white matter. Then it also consists of myelinated axons that enter and leave the various thalamic nuclei. Then you have sensory input from the skin, viscera, and the special sense organs that is transmitted to the thalamus before its distribution to the cerebrum. Okay, these are some of the things you also need to learn. Okay, so we are talking about the diencephalon, so we have started with the thalamus. Okay, so this, but here we're just talking about the lateral view of the right cerebral hemisphere and the medial view of the left cerebral hemisphere, and this is where the thalamus is located. Okay, so what are the functions of the thalamus? So the thalamus is the major relay station for most sensory impulses that reach the primary sensory area of the cerebral cortex from the spinal cord and the brainstem. Then in addition, the thalamus contributes to motor functions by transmitting information from the cerebrum and basal ganglia to the primary motor area of the cerebral cortex. Then the thalamus also relays nerve impulses between different areas of the cerebrum and plays a role in the maintenance of consciousness. Okay, so we are done with the thalamus. Let's now look at the hypothalamus. Okay, so the hypothalamus is a small part of the diencephalon. And the hypothalamus is composed of a number of groups of nerve cells, which is itself the nuclei. It is situated below and in front of the thalamus and immediately above the pituitary gland. Then the hypothalamus is linked to the posterior lobe of the pituitary gland by nerve fibers. Okay, so those are some of the things that you actually need to remember about the hypothalamus, is that especially this linkage to the posterior lobe of the pituitary gland by nerve fibers and the anterior lobe by a complex system of blood vessels. This one is definitely something that we definitely have to remember. Okay, then through these connections, the hypothalamus controls the output of hormones from both lobes of the gland. Okay, so this is what we are talking about. This is the pituitary gland. Then you have the anterior lobe of the pituitary gland, the posterior lobe of the pituitary gland. Okay, so these are some of the things you need to remember. So then above it, then you have the hypothalamus. Okay, then so you have to remember that the hypothalamus has nerves that are linked to the posterior and to the anterior. Okay, so what are the functions of the hypothalamus? So the hypothalamus controls many body activities and is one of the major regulators of homeostasis. Okay, then you have sensory impulses related to both somatic and visceral senses that arrive at the hypothalamus, as do impulses from the receptors for vision, taste, and smell. Then you have other receptors within the hypothalamus itself continually monitor osmotic pressure, glucose level, and certain hormone concentrations, and also the temperature of blood. Then you have the hypothalamus that has several. The hypothalamus has several very important connections with the pituitary gland and produces a variety of hormones. Okay, then other functions with which the hypothalamus is concerned include control over the autonomic nervous system, the appetite and satiety, thirst and water balance, body temperature, emotional reactions such as pressure, fear, rage, sexual behavior including mating and child rearing, biological clocks, or the circadian rhythms, e.g. sleeping and waking cycles. Then the body temperature and secretion of some hormones. Okay, then we also have some of the important functions of the hypothalamus. Is number one, control of the ANC, which is the autonomic nervous system. So the hypothalamus controls and integrates activities of the autonomic nervous system, which regulates contraction of smooth muscle and cardiac muscle and the secretions of main glands. Then through the autonomic nervous system, the hypothalamus is a major regulator of visceral activities, including regulation of heart rate, movements of food through the gastrointestinal tract, and contraction of the urinary bladder. Okay, then also we have production of hormones. So the hypothalamus produces several hormones and has two types of important connections with the pituitary gland, an endocrine gland located inferior to the hypothalamus. Then firstly, the hypothalamic hormones known as releasing hormones and inhibiting hormones are released into the capillary networks in the median eminence. Then the bloodstream carries these hormones directly to the anterior lobe of the pituitary gland, where they stimulate or inhibit secretion of the anterior pituitary hormones. Okay. Then secondary, we have axons that extend from the paraventricular and supraoptic nuclei through the infundibulum into the posterior lobe of the pituitary. Then the cell bodies of these neurons make one of two hormones, we have oxytocin or antidiuretic hormone. Then their axons transport the hormones to the posterior pituitary where they are released. Okay, so then you have regression of emotional and behavioral patterns. So together with the limbic system, the hypothalamus participates in expressions of rage, aggression, pain, and pleasure, and the behavioral patterns related to sexual arousal. Then there is also regulation of eating and drinking. So the hypothalamus regulates food intake. It contains a feeding center which promotes eating and a satiety center which causes a sensation of fullness and cessation of eating. So the hypothalamus also contains a thirsty center. When certain cells in the hypothalamus are stimulated by rising osmotic pressure of the extracellular fluid, they cause a sensation of thirst. Then the intake of water by drinking restores the osmotic pressure to normal, removing the stimulation and relieving the thirst. Okay, and then you also have control of body temperature. So the hypothalamus also functions as the body's thermostat. So if the temperature of blood flowing through the hypothalamus is above normal, then the hypothalamus directs the autonomic nervous system to stimulate the activities that promote the heat loss. Then also when blood temperature is below normal, by contrast, the hypothalamus generates impulses that promote heat production and retention. Then we also have regulation of circadian rhythm and states of consciousness. So the suprachiasmatic nucleus of the hypothalamus serves as the body's internal biological clock because it establishes circadian rhythms, patterns of biological activity, such as the sleep-wake cycle that occur on a circadian schedule, and you have the cycle of about 24 hours. Okay, then we have the epithalamus. So then we have the epithalamus. So the epithalamus is a small region superior and posterior to the thalamus, and it consists of the pineal gland and the abenular nuclei. Then you have the pineal gland, which is considered part of the endocrine system because it secretes the hormone melatonin. Okay. Then you have the melatonin, which appears to contribute to the setting of the body's biological clock, which is controlled by the hypothalamus. Then as more melatonin is liberated during darkness than in light, this hormone is thought to promote sleepiness. Then the abenular nuclei are involved in olfaction, especially emotional responses to odors. Okay, so that's the epithalamus. Then let's go to the cerebrum. So the cerebrum is the largest part of the brain, and it occupies the anterior and middle cranial fossa. Then it provides us with the ability to read, write, and speak, to make calculations and compose music, and to remember the past, plan for the future, and imagine things that have never existed before. Then it also consists of an outer cerebral cortex and an internal region of the cerebral white matter and gray matter nuclei deep within the white matter. Okay, so let's start with the cerebral cortex. So the cerebral cortex is a region of the gray matter that forms the outer rim of the cerebrum and contains billions of neurons. Then the folds are called the gyri or convolutions. Then the deepest grooves between folds are known as fissures. The shallower grooves between the folds are termed sulci. Then the longitudinal fissure separates the cerebrum into the right and the left halves, called the cerebral hemispheres. Then you have the falx cerebri, which is formed by the dura mater that separates the two hemispheres. The hemispheres are connected internally by the corpus callosum, which is a broad band of white matter containing axons that extend between the hemispheres. Okay, and those same axons that extend between the hemispheres are the ones that actually can carry even impulses between the right and the left hemispheres, and they connect both the hemispheres. Okay, so this is details of a gyra, sulcus, and the fissure. This is a fissure here, then this is the sulcus here, and this is the gyrus here. So this is the cerebrum and divided into the left hemisphere, the right hemisphere. Okay. Then for descriptive purposes, each hemisphere of the cerebrum is divided into lobes, which take the names of the bones of the cranium under which they lie. Okay. So you have the frontal, parietal, temporal, occipital lobes. So the boundaries of the lobes are marked by the deep sulci, which are the fissures, and these are the central, lateral, and parietal occipital sulci. Then the central sulci separates the frontal lobe from the parietal lobe. The lateral sulci, which separates the frontal lobe from the temporal lobe. The parietal occipital sulcus, which separates the parietal lobe from the occipital lobe. So this is the frontal lobe, where the frontal bone is, and there is a central sulci that is separating the frontal lobe to the parietal lobe. Then this is the parietal lobe. Then you have the parietal occipital sulci, which is separating the parietal lobe with the occipital lobe. Then this is the occipital lobe where the occiput is. So this is what you're talking about. This is the occipital lobe. You have the frontal lobe, and you have the parietal lobe, and you have the temporal lobe. Okay, these are the lobes we are talking about in question. Okay, then the cerebral white matter consists of primarily of myelinated axons in three types of tracts. Okay, the one we have association tracts, which contain axons that conduct nerve impulses between the gyri in the same hemisphere. Okay, then you have the commissural tracts, which contain axons that conduct nerve impulses from gyri in one cerebral hemisphere to corresponding gyri in the other cerebral hemisphere. Then we have three important groups of commissural tracts, which are the corpus callosum, the largest fiber bundle in the brain, containing about 300 million fibers. Then you also have an anterior commissure and the posterior commissure. Then the last tract is the projection tract. This one contains axons that conduct nerve impulses from the cerebrum to the lower parts of the central nervous system, the thalamus, the brainstem, or the spinal cord, or from lower parts of the central nervous system to the cerebrum. Then an example is the internal capsule, a thick band of white matter that contains both ascending and descending axons. So these are the association tracts. We have the commissural tracts in the brain. Okay. Then we have the functional areas of the cerebrum. So meaning there are some functional areas that are found in the cerebrum. So the main areas of the cerebrum associated with sensory perception and voluntary motor activities. So we have specific types of sensory, motor, and integrative signals that are processed in certain regions of the cerebral cortex. Then you have sensory areas that receive sensory information and are involved in perception, the conscious awareness of a sensation. Then we have motor areas that control the execution of voluntary movements. Then you have association areas that deal with more complex integrative functions such as memory, emotions, reasoning, will, judgment, personality traits, and intelligence. So we have sensory areas, motor areas, and association areas. Okay, those are the functional areas of the cerebrum. Okay, so if you are to take the motor areas, so the motor areas are here, or the sensory areas that are here, then you have the motor areas that are here. Okay, and from the front lobe you can see you have the premotor area, then you have the motor area. Then from the temporal lobe we have the taste area, the auditory area. We have the auditory area, the taste area is in the palatal area. Then the occiput, you have the sensory, you have the and the visual as well. Okay, now these are some of the areas now in details now. So what do the frontal lobe do? What do the occipital do? What do the palatal do? So from the occiput, you can see that there is the primary visual area, there is the visual association area. Okay, then from the palatal lobe, we have the somatosensory association area. Then you have the Wernicke's area. Okay, then in the temporal lobe, this is the temporal lobe below it, this, and from the, which one have we not done? We have the, okay, the frontal lobe. So frontal lobe, we have the premotor area, then you have the frontal eye field area. That's the frontal area. Then you also have the prefrontal cortex, but we are going to go through these areas in details, and of course you can't master this at once. You need to be revising it and each and every day for you to actually know which lobe is for this function and for this function. Okay, but let's look at each lobe in details, or each association area at each area in details. Okay, so let's start with the sensory areas. So sensory information arrives mainly in the posterior half of both cerebral hemispheres, in regions behind the central sulci. Then in the cerebral cortex, primary sensory areas receive sensory information that has been relayed from the peripheral sensory receptors through the lower regions of the brain. So we have the post-central sensory area, you have the sensory speech area, you have the auditory hearing area, the olfactory or smell area, you have the taste area, of the visual area. These are sensory. Okay, then the sensory areas, they start with the post-central or the sensory area. So this is the area behind the central sulcus. Then here, sensations of pain, temperature, pressure, touch, knowledge of muscular movement, and the position of the joints are perceived. So the sensory area of the right hemisphere receives impulses from the left side of the body and vice versa. Then the size of the areas representing different parts of the body is proportional to the extent of sensory innervation. For instance, larger region of the somatosensory area receives impulses from the lips and fingertips than from the thoracic or hip. Okay, so these are the sensory, the postcentral. Okay, so this is what we're talking about. For instance, from the tip, then that's where from the tip, the thoracic, these are the postcentral area where now information is going to be going to travel from. Okay, then you have the primary somatosensory area, which allows you to pinpoint where somatic sensations originate, so that you may know exactly where on your body to swat that mosquito. For instance, if the mosquito is biting you, the primary somatosensory area actually allows you to pinpoint where somatic sensations are originating from. So the sensory speech area, this is situated in the lower part of the parietal lobe and extends into the temporal lobe. It is here that the spoken word is perceived. There is also a dominant area in the left hemisphere in right-handed people and vice versa. So meaning those who are left-handed, there is a dominant area in the those who are right-handed, then it's the left. Those who are right-handed is the left. Those who are left-handed is the right side. Okay, that is dominant. Okay. Then you have the auditory or hearing area. So this lies immediately below the lateral sulcus within the temporal lobe. Then the cells receive and interpret impulses transmitted from the inner ear by the cochlea or auditory part of the vestibulocochlear nerve, the 80th cranial nerve. Then, apart from the auditory, you have the olfactory, which is for smell. So this lies deep within the temporal lobe, where impulses from the nose via the olfactory nerves, the first cranial nerve, are received and interpreted. Then you also have the taste area, which is thought to lie just above the lateral sulcus in the deep layers of the sensory area. So this is the area where impulses from the special nerve endings in the taste buds, in the tongues, and the lining of the cheeks, palate, and pharynx are perceived as taste. Then you have the visual area, which lies behind the parieto-occipital sulcus and includes the greater part of the occipital lobe. So the optic nerves, which is the second cranial nerve, pass through the eye to this area, which receives and interprets the impulses as visual impressions. Okay, then finally we have the motor areas of the cerebrum. So the motor outputs from the cerebral cortex flows mainly from the anterior part of each hemisphere. Then among the most important motor areas are the following: of the precentral motor area, of the premotor area, of the motor, or this is the Broca's speech area. Then you have the frontal area. So let's start with the precentral motor area, which lies, so this one lies in the frontal lobe, immediately anterior to the central sulcus. So the cell bodies are pyramid shaped, where we have the bed cells, and they initiate the contraction of skeletal muscles. That's it. Okay. Then a nerve fiber from the base cells passes downwards through the internal capsule to the medulla oblongata, where it crosses to the opposite side, then descends in the spinal cord. Then at the appropriate level in the spinal cord, the nerve impulses crosses a synapse to stimulate a second neuron, which terminates at the motor end of a muscle fiber. So that's the precentral motor area for skeletal muscle contraction. Okay, so this means that the motor area of the right hemisphere of the cerebrum controls voluntary muscle movement on the left side of the body and vice versa. Okay, then the neuron with its cell body in the cerebrum is the upper motor neuron, and the other with its cell body in the spinal cord is the lower motor neuron. Then in the motor area of the cerebrum, the body is represented upside down. That is, the cells nearest the vertex control the feet, and those in the lowest part control the head, neck, and the fingers. So in that diagram that we are looking at, you find that the motor areas are upside down. So the fingertips are the ones which are found on top, whilst the head, the neck, and the faces and the finger are of course the one which are found in the vice versa. So in short, we are saying the cells that are near the vertex control the feet. So the ones that are near the vertex are controlling things that are downwards, the feet. Then those that are lowest parts, they control things that are up, like the head, the neck, the face, and the fingers. Okay. Then the sizes of the areas of the cortex representing different parts of the body are proportional to the complexity of movement of the body part, not to its size. Then in comparison with the trunk, the hand, the foot, tongue, ribs are represented by a large cortical. Okay, so that's one of the reasons you need to actually um, remember the right side controls the left side, and the lower portions controlled by the ones are furthest, which are nearest. The upper part are one which are furthest. This is what we are talking about. You find that the one near the vertex, the one which are closest, okay, actually we are controlling the feet, the fingers. Then the one that are now furthest away, the one that are controlling now the lips, the face. So that's what we are talking about. I hope the diagram has made sense now. Okay, so let's continue. So let's go to the premotor area. So this lies in the frontal lobe, immediately anterior to the motor area, and the cells are thought to exert a controlling influence over the motor area, ensuring an orderly series of movement. For example, in tying a shoe lace or writing, main muscles contract, but the movement must be coordinated and carried out in a particular sequence. Such a pattern of movement, when established, is described as manual dexterity, which is a skill in performing tasks. Okay, then we have the motor, which is the Broca's speech area, which is located in the frontal lobe close to the lateral cerebral sulcus. So this group of nerve cells control movements necessary for speech. So it is dominant in the left hemisphere in right-handed people and vice versa. Okay, then you have the frontal area, which extends anteriorly from the premotor area to include the remainder of the frontal lobe. Then it is a large area and is more highly developed in humans than in any other animals. Then it is thought that the communications between this and the other regions in the cerebrum are responsible for the behavior, character, and emotional state of the individual. Then you also have association areas. So association areas are connected with one another by association tracts. So this includes the somatosensory association area, you have the visual association area, the facial recognition area, you have the auditory association area, you have the orbitofrontal cortex, of the Wernicke's or the posterior language area, of the common integrative area, of the prefrontal cortex or the frontal association area, and of the frontal eye field area. Okay, and then let's talk about the somatosensory association area. This one receives input from the primary sensory area as well as from the thalamus and the other parts of the brain. And in terms of functions, this one permits you to determine the exact shape and texture of an object by feeding it, and to sense the relationship of one body part to another. Then the storage of memories of past somatic sensory experiences, enabling you to compare current sensations with previous experiences. Then you have the visual association area, which receives sensory impulses from the primary visual area and the thalamus. In terms of functions, it relates present and past visual experiences, and it is essential for recognizing and evaluating what is. Okay, then let's go to the facial recognition area, which receives nerve impulses from the visual association area and functions. This area stores information about faces and it allows you to recognize people by their faces. So, as the name suggests, facial recognition area. Then the other area is the auditory association area. So this one receives the nerve impulses from the primary auditory area in the temporal cortex. This one allows you to recognize a particular sound as speech, music, or noise, and also even recognize to whom the speech belongs to. So we have the orbitofrontal cortex, which receives sensory impulses from the primary olfactory area and functions. This area allows to identify odors and to discriminate among the different odors. Then lastly, we have finally we have the Wernicke's area. This one functions is to interprets the meaning of speech by recognizing spoken words. Then it is active as you translate words into thoughts. Then also contribute more verbal communication by adding emotional content such as anger, joy to spoken words. Then you have the common integrative area, which is bordered by the somatosensory, visual and auditory association areas. Then it receives nerve impulses from the areas and from the primary gustatory area, the primary olfactory area, and the thalamus and the parts of the brain. Then functions of this area is to integrate sensory. So this area integrates sensory interpretations from the association areas and impulses from the other areas, allowing the formation of thoughts based on a variety of sensory inputs. It then transmits signals to the other parts of the brain for the appropriate response to the sensory signals it has interpreted. And then we have the prefrontal cortex, which is the frontal association area. So this area has numerous connections with other areas of the cerebral cortex, thalamus, hypothalamus, and cerebrum. So functions of this area is that it's concerned with the makeup of a person's personality, complex learning abilities, recall of information, initiative, judgment, foresight, reasoning, intuition, mood, planning for the future, and development of the abstract ideas. So these are all found in the prefrontal cortex or the frontal association area. Then you have the frontal eye field area, whose function is that it controls voluntary scanning movements of the eyes, like those you just used in actually reading this sentence and in actually reading through this sentence with me. So that's the frontal eye field area. Okay, so that's actually the end. So I know this is bulky, but the good part about this is that the information is a lot, but what we ask about in exams is actually a few, because we can't necessarily ask you what does the facial recognition area do, because I mean it's easy. The facial recognition area, of course, it recognizes faces. So from here, no, definitely you have to know how CSF flows, and of course if how to label the brain, and any other things maybe I may not have mentioned, but otherwise that's the thing about the central nervous system. Oh, okay. Then finally we call it tutorial, and thank you for watching. If you haven't subscribed, please subscribe and like this video and share to people who think it's going to benefit. And of course we are doing this